Today, you are part of a global conversation about our shared future. So what is this TedX? TedX is an initiative of the TED Conference, a non-profit devoted to ideas worth spreading. We grant free licenses to allow TED-like events to spread globally. This event today is based on the TED Conference format and ideals, but is independently organized by your local community. So please make sure to thank the team of volunteers who worked so hard on today's event. It's their ideas, dedication and time that made it all possible. It's they who booked all the speakers, and the views you'll hear today are of course those of those speakers, not necessarily of TEDs. We hope their talks spark an exciting conversation among you. It is a day for curiosity and for skepticism, for openness and for critical thinking, for inspiration and for action. The more you enter into it, the more you'll take out. And now, on with the show.
Good evening. Welcome to tonight's event under the banner of Myth of Rationality. Thank you all so much for coming. We all make decisions on a daily basis. Small decisions, big decisions, significant ones, insignificant ones. And most of us make these decisions, in most cases, without actually thinking about why we do these decisions. We all just assume that we are rational human beings, and that's why we do certain things the way we do them. However, in the last few years to 1 or 2 decades, more and more voices have been arguing about the fact that we might not be rational at all. That we don't make decisions because they're logical or they make sense to us, but rather for reasons that we don't often realize. These findings have implications for a lot of areas, from economics to arts and design. And in the end, what we kind of would like to happen today is that you leave after this event and gain a new perspective on the fact of how you may influence your own decisions, but also how other people and objects in this world might influence how you make decisions without you even realizing. And to start us off, we have a fellow University of Glasgow student here today. Julie is a second-year economics and politics student. She has represented this university at not only the European, but also the World Debates Championships. Pretty successful, if I may add to that. And she will tell you today why probably you should question whether your decisions are logical or make sense to you. Because she will show you that a lot of the decisions that you make might be influenced without you even realizing in her talk about humans, the good, the bad, but also the outright irrational. And I welcome her onto the stage.
I'm just gonna check this is on, okay? Can everybody hear? Okay, cool. Great. So I'm sure this has happened to you previously, but picture this. You're in a club, you're having some drinks with some friends, you're chilling, and then you look across the room and you see that one cutie, and you're like, right, Julie, this is my time. I'll go up to them and I will chat them up. So you go there and you're slowly approaching, and then you get closer and closer to this person's face, you're squinting, and then you're like, yeah, never mind. What has just happened there? Your eyes have obviously deceived you. But this is fine, because this happens all of the time. You are used to your sensory organs deceiving you. There is an entire market online for optical illusions, right? So I'm sure you're familiar with this one. Who sees the first line as being longer? Put your hands up. Yeah, so most of you, right? But obviously, when we actually take a look at the measurements, you can see that all of the lines are equal. And the beauty with this illusion is that when I take it away, you still see the first line as being longer. This is the way that a lot of illusions work, is that even when they're pointed out to you, you still can't help but see the illusion. So you go about your daily life assuming that some things in your sensory apparatus are going to fail. You never assume that your eyes or your ears are foolproof. So then the question becomes, why don't you apply the same sort of logic to another, maybe more complex and more core organ in your body, which is, of course, your brain. Your brain fails too. Like, you go about your life thinking that you are absolutely rational in the way that you spend your money or in the way that you think about like who you spend time with. You think you are a pretty good risk assessor. And more broadly, we build entire economic models on the presumption that humans are irrational, that humans are rational, and then like act absolutely shocked I tell you, at the moment where we realize that these models don't necessarily fit with reality. Your brain fails too. So let's look at some ways in which your brain is absolutely fallible. Your first value will be the framing bias. So basically, human brains are absolutely terrible at gauging the objective value of things. So if I come up to you and I'm like, here is this can of soup. Do you think this can of soup is worth 50p? Probably your answer would be like, I don't know, like, let me see the canned soup aisle in Tesco and maybe I'll tell you. So basically, at the moment where we are asked questions, it really matters what goes into that question to determine the outcome that we actually end up picking. It is all about context. Obviously, both of these dots are the same, just like in the previous illusion, right? So for example, take buying a vaccine. You're probably way less likely to buy it if I tell you that it has a 20% death rate as compared to an 80% survival rate, even though logically, this is the same information that I'm actually providing you on a hypothetical level. Now, a more interesting experiment was run by Dan Ariely. So he's the author of Predictably Irrational. You will see him speak, I think, in a bit. Basically, he's done very relevant research on dating. So basically, he had two groups. The first group got asked, who would you rather date? So between Alfred, Bob, and like a slightly modified version of Alfred. And then the second group got the same question, but with Alfred, Bob, and a slightly like under Bob. And obviously, like rationally, you think nobody's going to pick the middle options. So then probably they'll have like roughly the same preferences in terms of whether we want to take Alfred or whether we want to take Bob. Like obviously the options that they're never going to pick aren't really going to play into their calculuses. But this is not what Dan Ariely found. He found that the group that got the uglier version of Alfred chose Alfred disproportionately, and the opposite was true for the people that got the uglier version of Bob. That is because at the moment where you get a slightly altered version of an option, you are much more likely to choose the option that was initially altered, right? Because you look at Alfred and you're like, I can see all of the ways in which your facial features could have gone wrong, so I'm more likely to appreciate the fact that they didn't. So I'm probably going to pick you, even though maybe the other option would have been equivalent or even slightly better. So pro dating advice from a behavioral economist: if you ever go out clubbing, take a friend that looks slightly similar to you, but is a bit uglier. And also, if you get asked out by a friend that looks like you, second guess their decision to take you out, maybe questionably. The second way in which you fail at thinking, availability bias. So the previous information that you have about a phenomenon dictates the way in which you think about this phenomenon. So basically, this was tried out really nicely by a magazine that had a very dedicated readership. What they did is that they got a whole bunch of random words and they inserted them into their articles for a period of 6 months. And then their dedicated readers got a list of random words, some of which showed up in the magazine and some of which that they were never exposed to. And they were asked to say which one of these do you think are more positive sounding or denote positive effects. People were disproportionately likely to think that the words that they had previously been exposed to mean positive things or sound better than the words they had never been exposed to. And this is relevant because none of them consciously realized that they were making this decision. They subconsciously believed that those random words are better than the other ones, even though both of these categories of words just mean gibberish. Another another experiment on this was basically done in the run-up to the election in 2000s between George W. Bush and Al Gore. So basically people were asked two things. One, they were asked, imagine either George W. Bush or Al Gore winning, and then secondly, which one do you think is more likely to actually win? People that were asked to imagine George W. Bush winning were then more likely to assess the probability of him winning as higher than the people in the other group who thought Al Gore was more likely to win. So even if these people didn't even have a memory of them winning, they just constructed one in their head, that was enough to make them believe that that person was more likely to win. It doesn't have to be a real memory, it doesn't have to be a real information, it just has to be something that you think about. The third way in which you fail at thinking, the representativity bias, that's a hard word to say, right? So basically the mental preconceptions that you have about things also denote the way in which you relate to those things, sometimes at the expense of nuance and accuracy. So basically, these are 10 coin flips. H is heads, T is tails. Which one do you think is more random? Who thinks the first one? Put your hand up. Yeah, right. So the first one looks more random, but in reality, they're both equally probable, because still the probability of flipping, of getting heads when you flip a coin is still 50-50, and these events are not correlated to each other in any way. But the first one looked more random, because it looked more like the conception that you have about randomness, that it's not ordered, that it's all a mess, right? And you would think that getting like 5 heads in a row is extremely improbable, so you would say that that is less probable at the expense of, like, you know, numbers and logic and things like that. Another one of my favorite things, another like favorite experiment of mine. So basically, a group of people was asked, so they were given this brief description of a person. So Anna has a bachelor in economics and is interested in social rights movements. So which one of these things is more likely? A, Anna is a bank teller, or B, Anna is a bank teller and an activist. And people disproportionately thought that the second one was more likely, even though it is obviously the other way around, because the first one has only one constraint, and the second one has that constraint and an additional one. So obviously, like, in terms of a graphic representation of this, it is obvious that it's less likely that you're going to have a bank teller and an activist. But you already created a stereotype of Anna in your head when you were told that information about her. So you're much more likely to, via confirmation bias, to believe that she also is an activist. Now, hopefully at this point you are persuaded that your brain can sometimes fail. Now, what does this actually mean? How does this translate in real life? So in terms of framing bias, this is the offer that the economist has for subscriptions. So the first one is just the digital subscription, then you have the print subscription, and then you have the print and web subscriptions. Look at the last two ones. The same price for the print subscription and the print and web subscription. Like, obviously there's something wrong here. Who would choose the second one when you can get basically the same deal but also extra, right? So when you run trials and you ask people which one of these they would prefer, obviously nobody chooses the second one because they can read words and they're not dumb. You have 84% for the more expensive one and then 16% for the less expensive one. But remember our thing about Alfred and Bob, right? Why would be, like, the second order question then becomes, why would the economist even offer something that people are not likely to choose? So to answer this question, people have also ran trials without the second option. And this are the results that they ended up having. So the cheaper option suddenly becomes more preferable. So you can see why the economist would put that second option, right? Because at the end of the day, they end up making less money because they end up selling, like, very, very high valued deals less. And it's the same rationale. So if we go back, so the second one is just a slightly worse version of the third one, right? But at the moment where you are given this context, you see all of the possible flaws in the third one, you see that they're not met, so you're much more likely to pick the third one at the expense of rational choice thinking, which would happen at the moment where you take all of that context away and you're just made to weigh up the two options. In terms of availability bias, so this is more prevalent when it comes to politics. So politicians that get a disproportionate amount of media coverage are more likely to be successful, regardless of their actual capacities. And like, I honestly can't think of any like example in recent memory, like it doesn't come to me, but I'm sure that you guys will be able to think of this, you know, on your own. It's just like on the tip of my tongue, I don't know. It's also, oops, I'm just gonna leave this gorgeous picture here. It's also very relevant in terms of airplane crashes. So there are a lot of people that are deadly afraid to go on planes, but they're very fine with driving, even though driving is like statistically way more like likely to lead in your death. Right? But this all comes down to the available information that you have about car crashes. Because like, the coverage of car crashes is basically zero, but for airplane crashes you have like Air Crash Investigation and Mayday and all of these like fancy TV shows. And while they're great to binge, like especially during exam season, they also contribute to you making slightly suboptimal decisions in terms of your transportation. On a slightly more depressing note, this is one of my fun facts of parties. So after 9/11, a whole bunch of people were deadly afraid to like fly, so they subbed out their plane tickets for car tickets. And in the run-up to the terrorist event, more people were driving, therefore more people were committing accidents. And it is estimated that the death toll of people making that choice, so that switch from flying to driving, it resulted in a larger death toll than the terrorist events of 9/11 itself. So I think this just goes to show how relevant it is for us to be thinking about these things. In terms of representativity bias, harder. This also is slightly more depressing insofar as this bias informs a lot of discriminatory opinions and decisions that people make when it comes to people's appearance or when it comes to characteristics that they can't change about themselves. And it is crucially important for us to understand this bias more so that we don't end up making the same mistakes that we did previously. Now, hopefully at this point you guys are very sad and you're disillusioned with the human experiment. You're like, oh come on, let's just like get rid of humanity and let animals do their own thing. We're terrible, we're irrational. What is the good thing about this? So let's end on some silver linings. All of these malfunctions of this that I've presented so far are malfunctions of a system that allows us to be great on a day-to-day basis. Because like probably in terms of availability bias, like probably if your friend has been shit to you like a lot of times in the past, probably they're going to continue to be shit to you, so you should cut them off, right? Like these biases are a byproduct of us thinking very, very fast. And thinking fast is absolutely crucial for us to be the civilization builders, to discover amazing technology, to be the overpowered apes that we are. Like it allows us to create amazing research that changes the lives of people, which, you know, that's like similar to, you know, the people that you will hear speak after me. And it also allows people that are very less competent, like myself, present nice ideas in a hopefully enjoyable and fun way. Like if we have to bite the bullet of these biases so that we get more TED Talks, and I think that's a worthy trade-off. So if you must take something away from this talk, let it be this. We are irrational, but we are predictably irrational. And being more in touch with our irrationalities helps us scrutinize our behavior and helps us build a society that is catered not for who we think we are, but who we really are. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Julie. Our next talk was actually recorded at a TED conference in Vancouver in 2014, I believe. And features Harvard psychologist Dan Gilbert, who talks about the fact how we as people perceive time and change when it comes down to ourselves, and introduces us to the psychology of our future selves.
You know, at every stage of our lives, we make decisions that will profoundly influence the lives of the people we're going to become. And then when we become those people, we're not always thrilled with the decisions we made. So young people pay good money to get tattoos removed that teenagers pay good money to get. Middle-aged people rush to divorce people who young adults rush to marry. Older adults work hard to lose what middle-aged adults work hard to gain. On and on and on. The question is, as a psychologist, that fascinates me is, why do we make decisions that our future selves so often regret? Now, I think one of the reasons I'll try to convince you today is that we have a fundamental misconception about the power of time. Every one of you knows that the rate of change slows over the human lifespan, that your children seem to change by the minute, but your parents seem to change by the year. But what is the name of this magical point in life where change suddenly goes from a gallop to a crawl? Is it teenage years? Is it middle age? Is it old age? The answer, it turns out, for most people is now, wherever now happens to be. What I want to convince you today is that all of us are walking around with an illusion that history, our personal history, has just come to an end. That we've just recently become the people that we were always meant to be and will be for the rest of our lives. Let me give you some data to back up that claim. So here's a study of change in people's personal values over time. Here's 3 values. Everybody here holds all of them, but you probably know that as you grow, as you age, the balance of these values shifts. So how does it do so? Well, we asked thousands of people. We asked half of them to predict for us how much their values would change in the next 10 years, and others to tell us how much their values had changed in the last 10 years. And this enabled us to do a really interesting kind of analysis, because it allowed us to compare the predictions of people, say, 18 years old to the reports of people who were 28, and to do that kind of analysis throughout the lifespan. Here's what we found. First of all, you're right. Change does slow down as we age. But second, you're wrong, because it doesn't slow nearly as much as we think. At every age from 18 to 68 in our data set, people vastly underestimated how much change they would experience over the next 10 years. We call this the end of history illusion. To give you an idea of the magnitude of this effect, you can connect these 2 lines, and what you see here is that 18-year-olds anticipate changing only as much as 50-year-olds actually do. Now, it's not just values, it's all sorts of other things. For example, personality. Many of you know that psychologists now claim that there are 5 fundamental dimensions of personality: neuroticism, openness to experience, agreeableness, extroversion, and conscientiousness. Again, we asked people how much they expected to change over the next 10 years, and also how much they had changed over the last 10 years. What we found? Well, you're going to get used to seeing this diagram over and over, because once again, the rate of change does slow as we age, but at every age, people underestimate how much their personalities will change in the next decade. And it isn't just ephemeral things like values and personality. You can ask people about their likes and dislikes, their basic preferences. For example, name your best friend, your favorite kind of vacation, what's your favorite hobby, what's your favorite kind of music. People can name these things. We asked half of them to tell us, do you think that that will change over the next 10 years? And half of them to tell us, did that change over the last 10 years? And what we find, well, you've seen it twice now, and here it is again. People predict that the friend they have now is the friend they'll have in 10 years. The vacation they most enjoy now is the one they'll enjoy in 10 years. And yet, people who are 10 years older all say, that's really changed. Does any of this matter? Is this just a form of misprediction that doesn't have consequences? No, it matters quite a bit, and I'll give you an example of why. It bedevils our decision-making in important ways. Bring to mind right now for yourself your favorite musician today and your favorite musician 10 years ago. I put mine up on the screen to help you along. Now, we asked people to predict for us, to tell us how much money they would pay right now to see their current favorite musician perform in concert 10 years from now. And on average, people said they would pay $129 for that ticket. And yet, when we asked them how much they would pay to see the person who was their favorite 10 years ago perform today, they say only $80. Now, in a perfectly rational world, these should be the same number, but we overpay for the opportunity to indulge our current preferences because we overestimate their stability. Why does this happen? We're not entirely sure, but it probably has to do with the ease of remembering versus the difficulty of imagining. Most of us can remember who we were 10 years ago, but we find it hard to imagine who we're going to be. And then we mistakenly think that because it's hard to imagine, it's not likely to happen. Sorry, when people say, I can't imagine that, they're usually talking about their own lack of imagination and not about the unlikelihood of the event that they're describing. The bottom line is, time is a powerful force. It transforms our preferences, it reshapes our values, it alters our personalities. We seem to appreciate this fact, but only in retrospect. Only when we look backwards do we realize how much change happens in a decade. It's as if, for most of us, the present is a magic time. It's a watershed on the timeline. It's the moment at which we finally become ourselves. Human beings are works in progress that mistakenly think they're finished. The person you are right now is as transient, as fleeting, and as temporary as all the people you've ever been. The one constant in our life is change. Thank you.
So Professor of Economics at the Smith Business School, and also the Dean for Interdisciplinarity and Impact at the College of Social Sciences. And he's going to show us today how we can combat stigma with the power of rebuilding. And so he's brought him on stage.
Thank you very much for this invitation. So I'm here today to talk about a piece of research that I have been doing in Kolkata over a number of different years. And this piece of research is about understanding stigma and understanding how one can combat stigma through the power of dream building. Let me begin a little bit by situating this piece of research in a broader research project that's actually, through serendipity rather than design, actually quite consistent with both the talks that have gone before. So in the first talk, you found the speaker talking about a number of different examples of mistakes. And a part of my research, and I'm very interested in the idea of mistakes. I'm an economist, I think a pretty conventional one, but I still think of myself, but I still think mistakes matter, especially the kind of mistakes that the first speaker was talking about. And what I have done in the theoretical part of my research is to really provide a characterization of mistakes and provide a characterization of why these mistakes matter and why we might expect to see them persist. So that research was reported in a paper in a journal that's listed on the slide. Then what I got interested in was trying to understand whether there was any connection between mistakes and adversity, or mistakes and disadvantage, and whether the experience of persistent disadvantage, marginalization, poverty, stigma, factors such as these, whether these led in some sense to systematic mistakes of a particular type. And what were the kind of interventions that one could think of that might mitigate some of those mistakes. So so this led me to understanding the notion of empowerment. This led me to the idea of empowerment. And actually, all this stuff started out when one of my PhD students, who is now himself an associate professor at Tilburg, he asked me this question at the beginning of his PhD, what is empowerment? And of course, I didn't know the answer to that, neither did he. Nor can I claim I know the answer to that today. But basically, that led me to this inquiry about understanding the link between mistakes and empowerment. So now what I'm going to be doing is I'm going to be not talking about the theory behind the empirical work. Instead, I'm going to be talking about the empirical work, which in a sense illustrates the theory that I have developed in the context of this research project. So let me just begin by telling you a little bit about the research, and this research has been presented in this paper and has received some publicity. Early versions of this, of the results that we got in the field experiment that I'm going to talk about were discussed and cited in the World Development Report of 2015. The professor Iris Bonnet in the Kennedy School of Government, she summarized 50 papers which in her view talked about gender, and this was one of the 50 papers, or the results of those 50 papers that she selected. And recently, the New York Times did an article on the economics of hope, discussed and cited the research that I'm going to be talking about here. So let me begin by let me talk a little bit about stigma, because that's going to be the context in which I'm going to be talking about this research. Since we are in Glasgow University, it is perhaps only apt to begin by talking about Adam Smith. Adam Smith is, of course, well known for his Wealth of Nations, but the book that Adam Smith actually wrote when he was in Glasgow University is The Theory of Moral Sentiments. And in this book, The Theory of Moral Sentiments, Adam Smith actually proposed a psychological theory of morality based on emotions and perceptions. And that's actually quite consistent with the kind of research that we're doing in behavioral economics today. But the interesting thing, the thing that I want to pick out from the Theory of Moral Sentiments, this quotation of Smith, it's interesting because it makes an explicit connection between stigma, poverty, and unfavorable regard. So Smith talks about how the reason poverty causes pain is not just because it can leave people feeling hungry, cold, and sick, but because it is associated with unfavorable regard. The poor man is ashamed of his poverty. Erving Goffman was a sociologist that studied race and racial bias in the US. And he also talked about stigma and how stigma affects the discriminated, stigmatized individual. So he talks about how those who have dealings with the stigmatized individual fail to accord him respect and regard, and he echoes this denial by finding that some of his own attributes warrant it. So what is a social, it's what someone else does to you, you kind of justify that by attributing it to some of your own attributes, some of your own characteristics, even though that may not be warranted, even though that may have no basis in reality. And then you find the work of Glenn Lowry, who is a very fine African-American economist, and he's also talked about race and racial bias, and he says that this kind of distorted self-perception, which is the result of internalizing stigma, can create a self-fulfilling pessimism about the returns from effort to certain activities. So what I want to do here is I want to make the general point, and again, I want to go to the empirical results that we have obtained. But before I do that, I just want to make the general point that we think of stigma as distorting self-worth and therefore affecting a person's perception of choices that are deemed to be appropriate for him or her. And this is the way in which we associate stigma with mistakes. So let me talk a little bit about the setting and the study design in Kolkata. So there are approximately 18,000 women who work in the sex work industry across different red light groups in Kolkata. And these red light areas in Kolkata typically consist of brothels and small supporting businesses. Now, sex workers as a occupation are severely stigmatized in India. They're vulnerable to exploitation by other stakeholders in the sex trade. And this tends to create, as different studies have shown, a sense of helplessness and low self-esteem and an overall fragile state of mind. So what we did in this study was we looked at 3 of these areas in Kolkata, Bowbazar, Kalighat, and Chetla. And then we looked at, and then we restricted the study to women who were aged under the age of 35. And we sampled, we did a baseline sample survey of the women working in these areas. And then what we did was we tried to find out the impact of a psychological training program called Dream Building on the sense of self-worth and the behavior of the women concerned. So we did this using a randomized controlled trial methodology, where we assigned the women into 2 groups. The treatment group consisted of women who were exposed to Dream Building. This training program that I'm going to get into more detail in a second, called Dream Building, and they met 8 times. And there was this other group of women who were not exposed to Dream Building, but they also met 8 times. And in both groups, a number of different common themes were discussed, such as anti-trafficking measures, collective actions to prevent harassment by the local police, etc., etc. But in addition to those components, for the treatment group, we had this psychological training which we call Dream Building. Now, what we find, now let me talk a little bit about Dream Building. Now, Dream Building is a program that has 8 sessions, and the first session is basically talking about sex work like other kinds of work. So the facilitator would come and say, today I went and I worked in an office and I got a salary. I sold my labor to get this salary. So, what's the difference between sex work and other types of work? Why do we think this type of work is different in any way? So it's about understanding the context and normalizing the context, or looking at the context in which sex workers work in a different way. The second session is about differentiating between wants and desires and dreams. And the third session is about differentiating between short-term and medium-term dreams. The fourth session is about finding out pathways from where you are to achieving those dreams, and so on. The important thing about Dream Building is not that it suggests a particular future. It just suggests that there is a future. Whatever that future is in the control of the party, of the person, of the concerned person, and this person can achieve that future by taking certain concrete actions today. So that's basically what Dream Building is about. And because the women were taking time off work to come in both the treatment and control group, to come to these Dream Building, to these 8 sessions, we gave them money. We gave them 100 rupees, which is about 40% of the daily wage to come to these sessions. So let me very briefly go over the results that we found. So the first thing is, of course, we did a baseline survey and an end-line survey where we asked the women in question, what this various questions that were indicators of their self-worth, or their perception of the self-worth. And we found that women in the treatment group were more likely to report more positive outcomes in the terms of self-worth. Now we come to the savings options, And because we were giving them this money, we provided them with two different types of savings choices. One was a fixed deposit account, in which you could keep the money, get a high interest rate, but the money was locked in for a year. And the other was a kind of current account with a low interest rate, but very good, withdraw the money at any point. Now, the important thing about these two different accounts is that the fixed deposit account simply converted into the current account if you withdrew money once in that year. So, from the point of view of a purely rational choice model would say that everybody should choose the fixed deposit account, because all that would happen if you broke the fixed deposit, there was no penalty. It would simply convert back into the lower interest rate current savings account. And yet we found that obviously not all women in the treatment and control group or more put the money in the fixed deposit, so that was a kind of mistake. But systematically we found that women in the treatment group who were exposed to dream building were more likely to put their money in the fixed deposit account than women in the control group. So we find here yet another example of a mistake that is systematic, and a mistake that and the kind of mistake that people are making here can be changed through these powerful psychological interventions. And then we find that we did a follow-up study 15 months after the initial intervention, and we found that this pattern of savings persisted, controlling for all kinds of different things. So we found that this pattern of savings persisted, that, so that was, I think, a very powerful piece of evidence. But the thing that really clinched it for me was the health-seeking behavior. Now, in this entire dream building exercise, health was not mentioned even once. We didn't talk about health at all. Yet, now, in the areas in which the women live and work, there are these different mobile health clinics. And we had records from the mobile health clinics documenting the visits the women made to check up their health on a regular basis. And we found that women who were exposed to dream building were more likely to engage in this health-seeking behavior than women who were not. Now, we interpret both these things as examples of future-oriented behavior, in that investing in your health today, of course, has a consequence today, but it also has a consequence for you in terms of determining what is open to you in the future. Saving in a fixed deposit, obviously, with a high return, will give you something back in the future, a high return in the future. So we call these things future-oriented behavior, and the psychological training program has an impact in making such behavior more likely than it does otherwise. And we really think that what we have found is a kind of lower bound of this impact. I should just acknowledge that a number of different research grants have enabled this work to happen, and as a consequence of the research that we have done, there is now an interest in the National Bank for Rural Development in India and the State Cooperative Bank in West Bengal. They're interested in taking some of these lessons about dream building and adapting it to understand to impact on women belonging to self-help groups, which are an entirely separate and distinct population of women. And then finally, AIDS Alliance have got in touch, and they want to use these type of dream building interventions in different parts of the world, including Vietnam. So I'm going to stop here and then let you get on to the next one.
We're going to take a short 10-minute break, so if you want to walk around a bit or talk to each other, you're fine to do so. We'll be back in 1 minute. Daniel Rielli is a professor for psychology and behavioral economics, and in his talk he looks at the way that we, as people mostly, look at inequality, and how the way we perceive, but also the way we wish inequality would be in our society, is not nearly as straightforward as you might think.
it would be nice to be objective in life, in many ways. And the problem is that we have these color-tainted glasses, and we look at all kinds of situations. For example, think about something as simple as beer. If I gave you a few beers to taste, and I asked you to rate them on intensity and bitterness, different beers would occupy different space. But what if we tried to be objective about it? In the case of beer, it would be very simple. What if we did a blind taste? Well, if we did the same thing, you tasted the same beer, but now in the blind taste, things would look slightly different. Most of the beers will go into one place. You will basically not be able to distinguish them, and the exception, of course, will be Guinness. Similarly, we can think about physiology. What happens when people expect something from their physiology? For example, we sold people pain medication. Some people, we told them that medications were expensive. Some people, we told them it was cheap. And the expensive pain medication worked better. It relieved more pain from people because expectations do change our physiology. And of course, we all know that in sports, if you're a fan of a particular team, you can't but help see the game develop from the perspective of your team. So all of those are cases in which our preconceived notions and our expectations color our world. What happened in more, let's say, important question? What happened with questions that have to do with social justice? So we wanted to think about what is the blind tasting version for thinking about inequality. So we started looking at inequality, and we did some large-scale surveys around the US and other countries. So we asked two questions. Do people know what kind of level of inequality we have? And then what level of inequality do we want to have? So let's think about the first question. Imagine I took all the people in the US and I sorted them from the poorest on the right to the richest on the left. And then I divided them into 5 buckets. The poorest 20%, the next 20%, the next, and the richest 20%. And then I asked you to tell me how much wealth do you think is concentrated in each of those buckets. So to make it simpler, imagine I asked you to tell me how much wealth do you think is concentrated in the bottom 2 buckets, the bottom 40%. Take a second, think about it and have a number. Usually we don't think for a second, have a real number in your mind. You have it? Okay, here's what lots of Americans tell us. They think that the bottom 20% have about 2.9% of the wealth. The next group has 6.4, so together it's slightly more than 9. The next group, they say, has 12%, 20. And the richest 20%, people think have 58% of the wealth. You can see how this relates to what you thought. Now what's reality? Reality is slightly different. The bottom 20% have 0.1% of the wealth. The next 20% have 0.2% of the wealth. Together it's 0.3. The next group has 3.9, 11.3. And the richest group has 85% of the wealth. So what we actually have and what we think we have are very different. What about what we want? How do we even figure this out? So to look at this, to look at what we really want, we thought about the philosopher John Rawls. If you remember John Rawls, he had this notion of what's a just society. He said a just society is a society that if you knew everything about it, you would be willing to enter it in a random place. And it's a beautiful definition, right? Because if you're wealthy, you might want the wealthy to have more money, the poor to have less. If you're poor, you might want more equality. But if you're going to go into that society in every possible situation and you don't know, you have to consider all the aspects. It's a little bit like blind tasting, in which you don't know what the outcome will be when you make a decision. And Rawls called this the veil of ignorance. So we took another large group of Americans, and we asked them the question in veil of ignorance. What is the characteristics of a country that would make you want to join it, knowing that you can enter randomly in any place? And here's what we got. What did people want to give to the first group, the bottom 20%? They wanted to give them about 10% of the wealth. The next group, 14% of the wealth, 21, 22, and 32. Now, nobody in our sample wanted full equality. Right? Nobody thought that socialism is a fantastic idea in our sample. But what does it mean? It means that we have this knowledge gap between what we have and what we think we have, but we have at least as a big gap between what we think is right to what we think we have. Now we can ask this question, by the way, not just about wealth, we can ask it about other things as well. So for example, we asked people from different parts of the world about this question. People who are liberals and conservatives, and they gave us basically the same answer. We asked rich and poor, they gave us the same answer. Men and women, NPR listeners and Forbes readers. And we asked people in England, Australia, the US, very similar answers. We even asked different departments of the university. We went to Harvard and we checked almost every department. And in fact, from Harvard Business School, where a few people wanted the wealthy to have more and the rich to have less, the similarity was astonishing. I know some of you went to Harvard Business School. We also asked this question about something else. So we asked, what about the ratio of CEO pay to unskilled workers? So you can see what people think is the ratio. And then we can ask the question, what do they think should be the ratio? And then we can ask, what is reality? What is reality? And you could say, well, it's not that bad, right? The red and the yellow are not that different. But the fact is, it's because I didn't draw them on the same scale. It's hard to see, there's yellow and blue in there. So what about other outcomes of wealth? Wealth is not just about wealth. We asked, what about things like health? What about availability of prescription medication? What about life expectancy? What about life expectancy of infants? How do we want this to be distributed? What about education for young people and for older people? And across all of those things, what we learned was that people don't like inequality of wealth, but there's other things that inequality, which is an outcome of wealth, is even more aversive to them. For example, inequality in health or education. We also learned that people are particularly open to changes in inequality when it comes to people who have less agency, basically young kids and babies, because we don't think of them as responsible to their situation. So what are some lessons from this? We have two gaps. We have the knowledge gap and we have a desirability gap. And the knowledge gap is something that we think about, how do we educate people? How do we get people to think differently about inequality and the consequences of inequality in terms of health, education, jealousy, crime rate, and so on. Then we have the desirability gap. How do we get people to think differently about what we really want? You see, the roles definition, the roles way of looking at the world, the blind tasting approach, takes our selfish motivation out of the picture. How do we implement that to a higher degree on a more extensive scale? And finally, we also have an action gap. How do we take these things and actually do something about it? I think part of the answer is to think about people like young kids and babies that don't have much agency because people seem to be more willing to do this. To summarize, I would say next time you go to drink beer or wine, first of all, think about what is it in your experience that is real and what is it in your experience that is a placebo effect coming from expectations. And then think about what it also means for other decisions in your life and hopefully also to policy questions that affect all of us. Thanks a lot.
All right. Last but certainly not least, we have Dr. Connie Walbrand from the University of Stirling. He's the director of the Center for Behavioral Science and also an associate professor at the university, and he will show us how small nudges can make us make better decisions. Welcome to the stage.
Okay. All right. Okay, so what if I told you that we could leverage the behavioral insights that we've heard about to improve decisions, and that we could do so without changing economic incentives in any meaningful way, and without forbidding any options. My name is Connie Walbrand. I am from the University of Stirling. I am a behavioral economist, and I'm very happy to be here today and for the opportunity to talk about a very exciting topic. And that's how behavioral economics goes about trying to improve our understanding of human behavior, and also how we can try to leverage these ideas towards improved outcomes. So, let's start off by imagining if you can, trying to predict the time it would take for dropping a massive ball from the ceiling of this building, or the roof of this building, and how long it would take before it would reach the ground. Now, we can actually do this using relatively simple models from physics, okay? Assuming actually that we are operating in a vacuum. Now, we can also try doing this with a paper. But if we were trying to do it with a paper, we will find this substantially more difficult, and we will find it very difficult to make an accurate prediction. Of course, the difference that makes a difference between these two cases is that in the one circumstance, we have environmental factors operating on the ball that don't really matter. But in the other case, these environmental factors really make a difference for how the paper falls to the ground. Okay? Now, of course, in neither of these cases are we actually operating in a vacuum, but this lack of realism doesn't really matter when it comes to making predictions. So we have used this very simple thought experiment, if you like, to identify a setting when the standard model will very accurately produce a prediction and when it will not. So, my first ever economics professor told me that wants are limited only by the sky, but that resources, unfortunately, are scarce. So, resources are scarce. So, of course, if this were not the problem, if we didn't have this sort of problem, we wouldn't really have a problem to talk about. This, in some sense, is the definition of an economic problem. Now, the fact that we can't have everything means that whenever we get something, we are also giving something else up. And this gives rise to this very important notion of a trade-off. And the fact that we have the trade-off also means something in terms of what it would imply for us to doing our best. Because doing our best will mean that we get these trade-offs right. So, the rational actor model that we've heard about is the model that has typically been used to predict behavior in economics. And we can think of, for this sort of purpose, we can think of the rational actor being somebody who has unlimited attention, unlimited cognitive powers for computation, perfectly informed of all probabilities, has perfect self-control, unlimited, and typically also selfishness. Okay? So behavioral economics has contributed, and we've heard about this in the previous talks also, has contributed by showing how we deviate from the behavioral model, not only on single instances, but systematically so. Okay, let's see if we can get this to work. Now, let me try something with you. So imagine if you can, a geometric object that does not have four corners. Okay, and keep this in your mind. So you will have a representation of an image already now, so just keep it there, and don't change it. Okay? Now imagine if you can, a second object that surrounds the first one. Okay, keep this also in your mind. Now if I were to guess what that object is, it would be something like that. Okay? Unfortunately, my mind reading powers are really limited, so if I'm going to guess about this, I need something else, something distinct of the standard model. In fact, there's significant structure to human psychology, and the ways in which we think, the mistakes that we make, and how we ultimately behave, is actually more similar to the falling ball than it is to the paper. But the fact that we sort of deviate from the traditional model in many instances doesn't mean that our behavior is random. It's absolutely not. But we are influenced by our decision environment in the same way as the paper. Okay. Okay. So behavioral economics has pointed to these sort of limitations. It's also pointed to how we deviate systematically, but it's also pointed to the environmental circumstances under which these deviations will make a difference. So if, and also when they will matter for our trade-offs. And this takes us straight to nudging. Okay? Nudging is a way of changing behavior in a predictable manner by leveraging knowledge of decision-making mechanism by altering, basically, the decision-making environment without reducing any options or affecting any incentives. And you can think of this as bonuses, fines, or any types of compensation you like. Okay? So let's think about a couple of examples where these nudges could be at work. So, in the UK right now, there are 6,000 people on the organ donation waiting list. Okay? And 400 people last year died while waiting. Last year alone. Okay? Now, organ donations is a matter of life and death. But how actually are decisions about donating an organ made? So, what we have here is the effective consent rate divided by country. Okay, so the number that we see are the number of people who are registered as organ donors. And to our left over here, we have a group of countries where citizens are part of an opt-in regime. That's to say, and the UK is among them. So that's to say, if people want to become organ donors, they have to take an active decision to become one. Okay, opting in. Now, on our right, the blue bars, they indicate the situation for a group of countries where citizens live in an opt-out regime. That's to say, they are by default already organ donors, and they have to make an active decision if they do not wish to remain one. Okay? Now, the default or the preset sort of decisions outcome that we have, they can have a dramatic outcome in terms of behavior. So if we're looking at this graph already, you can see that the country, even if we compare the highest and the lowest in each of these cases, the lowest in the Netherlands, which is in the opt-in regime, it has 27.5, and in the opt-out regime, 85.9. So if we compare these two, we will see that the Swedish rate compared to the Dutch rate is 3 times as high. Okay. Now, on the traditional model, this is not something that you would expect would have any type of substantial effect, because the default option doesn't actually tell us anything about what is optimal or not. Right? But behavioral economics tells us that this is very likely to happen actually. Why? Because people can perceive of this as implicit recommendation by the policymaker, for example, or it can be cognitively demanding to fill in paperwork and to actively seek out and actively maybe think about what would be right for you. Okay, so if you don't pay attention to this and misfortune strikes, you may or may not be an organ donor. Okay, so household energy consumption actually plays a very significant role in trying to reach policy targets. Is there something you can do about it? Trying to reach policy targets. Okay, so in the European Union alone, buildings are responsible for 40% of overall energy use. And it's also responsible for about 36% of all CO2 emissions. Okay? Now, because of this, improving the energy efficiency of buildings could help reduce the energy use and result in high energy savings of 5 to 6%, and reduce the CO2 emissions by about 6%. And it has been shown previously that very simple nudges like information provision or simplified information provision and social comparison can have effects or can reduce basically the use of energy. Okay? But what is actually a relatively recent discovery is that such effects can also be cumulative. By cumulative, I mean that you can treat people over and over and over and over by providing a social comparison, and they will keep reducing their energy use. It can also be long-term. This, of course, matters a lot if we are going to evaluate the worth of using a nudge. For how long is it going to last? Right? Now, what we are looking at here is the first page of a home energy use report. And it provides the resident with a neighbor energy use comparison. The blue bar here that says U shows how much the household has been using in terms of energy, and it compares this to a group called All Neighbors. This is basically 100 neighbors living close to the resident. Okay? And they provide your information about their use. There is also a green group, and that's the 20% of the most efficient households within these 100 households. Okay? It also provides you with a sort of performance statement saying how you're doing. In this case, it says you use more than average. And if that is the case, it also gives you some suggestions in terms of what you can do to reduce your energy use. Okay? Now, the study divided two groups into three different phases of information provision. One group in orange is called the continued group, and one group is called the blue group, the dropped group. Okay? And they divide them into three phases. So to begin with, they are in the baseline treatment or before treatment. And at this point, of course, nobody has received this comparison. So they haven't made any reductions yet. That's why they're at 0. Okay? Then after a period of time of receiving this neighbor comparison, both groups have made reductions in energy use. Only receiving this neighbor comparison. Okay? Now, after a while, in the third phase of the treatment, one of the groups is dropped. So the blue group is dropped, hence the name. And what we can see is that in this case, the continued group outperforms the dropped group. And this in itself is perhaps not so surprising. But there are two more comparisons that are worthy of note. Okay? One is this one. Because we may have worried that if we are going to continue with this perpetually, that this effect would wear off and it wouldn't keep going. But that's in fact not what we see. We see that it goes up. Something else that we could have worried about is that if we stop treating the group, then of course the reduction will fall and we sort of backslide and we'll go back to the original position. And to some extent we see that that was true, but critically it doesn't go back to the original level. Okay? So what this study tells us, and these are two very important points. It tells us that these simple nudges, they can have cumulative effects, number one. And two, they can also have long-term effects. Okay. Now, let's have a look at retirement saving. So, many people are not saving enough for retirement. And you will hear things being said in terms of there's a retirement crisis and so on. And the reason for that is because while we are not saving enough, we are also, it's also a major financial insecurity is also a major concern for the aging population. And if you are aware of the demographic shift, we know that we are also living longer and this group is expanding. Okay? So, behavioral economics has shown us that we typically prefer to consume things today. Prefer to consume now and we prefer to have pleasant things today. And costs and other unpleasant things, we prefer to have them in the future. Okay? Now, we say that people are present biased. A related phenomenon, another phenomenon, is loss aversion. And loss aversion basically means that we prefer, or rather, we dislike losses disproportionately more than we like equal gains. So I dislike losing, it feels worse, hurts me more to lose 100 pounds than it would to gain 100 pounds. So why don't we save more? Well, we basically, one reason is that we prefer to consume now rather than consuming in the future. Another reason is that decisions that involve our retirement are typically very complex and you will have to look up a lot of information and it requires some upfront cost and some upfront thought. Okay, and because we are present biased, we also put that type of effort into the future. Okay? And we procrastinate. But also, whenever we get a sort of savings amount being deducted from our account, we may experience that as an uncomfortable loss. And because we are loss averse, we tend to walk back on our commitments. Yeah. So, the Save More Tomorrow program tries to deal with these types of preferences. So, it basically, rather than asking people to save more now, today, it asks people to save more tomorrow. Okay? And we can sort of already see why that will work, because people who are present biased, can agree to pushing a cost into the future, right? But also, we needed to deal with the authors needed to deal with loss aversion. And to deal with loss aversion, they did something really very clever. And that is that they made sure that the increase in the savings happened at the time of a pay raise. Because then in your account you will get more and you will deduct less and you will feel that this is a net increase. Rather than getting the money first and then you will remove it, which will make you feel like a loss. So let's see how people in the program did. So this is an image from the first implementation of this program. And there are 3 groups of employees. And the bars there basically measure the savings rate for 3 different types of groups. And these groups, they had previously been invited to speak to a financial advisor. So the blue group up there, that's the group that didn't contact a financial consultant. So they made their own savings decision instead. The group in the middle accepted the consultant's recommended rates and they made a one-off saving. And the grey group, that's the group that joined the Save More Tomorrow program. They met with the financial consultant, but they didn't want to commit to this higher rate, so they entered the Save More Tomorrow program instead. So let's see how they did. And we start with the blue group, the group that made their own savings decision. So at the first pay raise, they are pretty much at the same level. At the second pay raise, at the third pay raise, the same. And at the fourth pay raise, still the same. So overall, this group stayed very constant straight through. Okay? Now let's look what happened to the people who accepted the consultant's recommended savings rate. First, they instantly increase. Instantly increase. So far so good, but let's see how they do going ahead. So at the second pay raise, they're at the same level. Third pay raise, they're at the same level. And the fourth pay raise, they're still at the same level. So here again, we see this powerful tendency for people to stick with the current arrangement. Whether they are in the blue group or whether they are in the orange group, they make an arrangement and they stay there. Okay, so the challenge here is to make people save more. And they do that by making people save more tomorrow. So let's see what happened to the group, the grey group, that joined the Save More Tomorrow program. They start off fairly low. And then at the first pay raise, they are already up. So they are actually up now at the blue level for those people who made their own saving decision. At the second pay raise, they are already in the lead. They are already in the lead. And the third pay raise, well, we have our winner. Okay? They are actually now saving twice as much as those people who made their own decision, and about 54% more than those who accepted the consultant's recommended savings rate. Okay? Now, this study became very famous, and it became famous in part, of course, because they managed to increase savings rate, but also because of the way they did it. So they managed to incorporate these insights about human behavior into the design of the program that on the traditional one otherwise would have been completely ignored. So, why do we find these sorts of things, including the previous talks, why do we find these things about behavioral economics so fascinating? Well, I personally believe that behavioral economics exposes us in many ways to what it means to be human. I think a lot of us are sort of interested in knowing more about how we work. But I think we can also recognize that many of the challenges that we are facing today, spanning health, wealth, and the environment, they are at least in part also behavioral problems. And nudging can probably be part of a solution. Now, we have seen in the case of organ donations that sometimes nudges can have very, very large and impressive effects. Sometimes. Tomorrow program. And that's significant because we can combine a lot of different, knowledge about a lot of different behavioral tendencies, address them jointly, and get a very large effect that way. Now, if we have a more nuanced understanding of human behavior, then we can design our choice environments in a much better way. And in that way, we can make sure that the choice environment helps to nudge us in a way such that we achieve better outcomes. So in this way, understanding human behavior and improving economic models, that's a difference that makes a real difference.